Do not attempt to adjust your settings. We have commandeered this channel and are now streaming our pirate broadcast. This is the Pirate Stream. Welcome to the Pirate Stream, Dialectical Dissidents, episode 24. I know it's been a very long time, but we're back and we have a lot to talk about. Courtney, how are you today?
I'm doing well. I'm excited to be back.
I know.
I love the new space.
Thank you. Thank you. It took this whole setup for those that have been watching TLAV. This is just the other side of the room. So we're in the main setup, and I have been promising to give them kind of a roundabout view, but as Courtney can attest to, the rest of it is still cluttered and not set up just yet. So we'll be getting to that.
Coming along. Yeah.
But yeah, it's been a process, and so we're very happy to be back. And I haven't even think I've told you, but I do have a couple people that are on the fence to be coming out to join us in studio. Yeah. And I would like to throw that out there again to anybody local, which, by the way, doesn't mean that we're necessarily going to say yes to everybody that reaches out. But anybody out there that's local in Tennessee that might want to come join us, and third mic kind of situation, reach out to us. It'd be fun to have some more people in here, and and we plan to get a lot more going on this in general. So let's get into some interesting stuff. I mean, I was just telling her that I was dying to talk to her specifically about the SAVE Act, digital ID kind of conversation, because I think it's a really interesting one. And I want to start actually with a shout to our recent show that we just put up. And I wanted to make sure we saw the interesting, or really just kind of, proud of how much reach it got, which I don't think Courtney's seen yet. It got 314,000 views, our last show. Right?
Amazing.
Which I have to say, though, I'm a little bit concerned. Like and Wake Up, we talked about the idea that this might be a little bit gamed on Rumble, that it only has 5 comments. So I'm like, but maybe somebody embedded it with a large show somewhere else, and so you don't get it. But either way,
that does happen.
We wanted to kind of just touch base to start with this great show, this great discussion we had last time. We were talking about the NACs, the natural asset value. And asset value, excuse me. And Courtney recently spoke in front of Congress about this, right?
I did. I went to the state capitol. I actually spoke on, I think, 25 shows about this, including my own. I started with, I don't know how long it was now, but it was several months ago, where on my radio show, I did like an emergency broadcast. I had heard about this, and it was back when the SEC was trying to put a proposed rule to they partnered up with the New York Stock Exchange, and it was actually the Intrinsic Exchange Group, who was funded by the Rockefellers, Abadir Ventures, and IBD Labs, and a bunch of other people like the World Wildlife Foundation. And they literally created this entity, the IEG, solely to partner up with the New York Stock Exchange to put the NACs, the natural asset companies, up on the New York Stock Exchange, which is, completely like unconstitutional and really just a gross overreach of power. But I was my thought at the time, I didn't even think that we were going to be able to stop them, but we did. There was enough pressure that they did withdraw the proposal. But at the time, my thought was just that there was 25 state attorney generals who had made a legal case, and they really brought all the, legalities to the forefront of how they would be standing in a lawsuit. So my thought was that if we could just get enough people to make comments, submit their comment, then everybody who submitted a comment would have legal standing.
Interesting.
And so that was really why I was trying to sound the alarm. I was just like, I want people to submit their comments, and you could even, you didn't have to write your own comment, because I know that's daunting for people. You could just include somebody else's comment, like American Steward for Liberty did a great job. Marlo Oaks, the state treasurer for Utah, did a really great job, and he got 25 actually, other state treasurers to join in. And you could just say, like, I include this as part of my comment, and I support this commentary, and that would suffice, that would count. So, but they withdrew the proposal. They felt enough pushback, which is great. Of course, they are rebranding as usual and retooling.
Always.
It doesn't mean that we don't need to stay vigilant, but it's a really encouraging sign that at least it felt enough pushback to, feel like they had to retool.
I think it's an amazing, it's a good time, a good moment to recognize that is the power of actually, as I always frame it, doesn't have to be beyond the paradigm, but just people coming together. But when you can see that we, from any perspective politically, recognize that there's an issue with that and come together, the point is just enough people pushing back, it really can make a difference, and I think that's a very positive message there. And, but as you pointed out, and this is not a failure or a loss. It's the yin and yang of the world. They will come back around and do it from a different angle. They will always, they being whatever entity we're discussing, people in power that have an interest in what you're trying to accomplish and they don't care what you want. But this is an interesting conversation about the, gamification, if you will, token, of nature of the. And Whitney was recently talking about this as well, and it's definitely a very clear objective. And I think this overlaps, as I think you've already talked about, with not just outside, but our bodies as well, like just anything that exists in a natural sense being bet on, like some kind of casino for natural things. It's an alarming reality. Which, by the way, I think we mentioned at the time in the last show. Clearly, then there's going to be an incentive. Somebody out there will be incentivized to make it go bad or whatever that would mean to benefit off the decline of something, because it works both ways, right?
Yeah. Well, I think there's also the, the concern of like the patenting. So that's a way that they could tokenize humans. They would have ownership. But essentially what they were doing with these natural asset companies is they were commodifying like literally the air that we breathe. And they thought that this is why we know they're not going to just let up, because they thought they stood to gain upwards of $4 quadrillion.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And that's a number that's just unfathomable. I mean, at that point, you might as well just say it's like infinite,
right.
Like,
our brains can't comprehend that.
Like $4 quadrillion.
That's crazy.
But that's what they thought. And it's all through, this is why we need to stop with any allowance. And I think at the state level of carbon pricing, any kind of carbon offshoot incentivization. Because that really is the linchpin. If you cut that off, then none of this can move forward.
Yeah, right.
But they wanted, I used to joke about how like they were going to commodify the water. And then of course, Nestle did.
Yeah,
and now that's just commonplace. But now, and then I was like, the next thing is going to be the air we breathe. And the scariest part of what was going on with the NACs, the natural asset companies, is that you could have private land that could be listed on this public stock exchange where you wouldn't even know. And they do through ecosystem management rights. They would be able to, it's all about the degrowth incentivization. So they could actually preclude you from being able to use your own land for anything productive. So you couldn't, farm on it. You couldn't drill if you had oil or mine for, valuable.
Unless they claim
resources.
it's national security interest or some kind of overlap that they just go omit it. It's always, you're not allowed to.
Right. Well, that was what was so duplicitous about it, is that they could say that you're not allowed to, but now through the ecosystem management rights, they could, and then it would become delisted as a NAC.
Right.
But they already have the ecosystem management rights, so they have purview, so they can do whatever they want. Now, and that could mean that, like, a foreign entity could be doing it,
right?
Because they can invest on the public stock exchange.
I mean, it's an ESG similar concept. I think we made the same point last time, is that, it's as the UK and the United States arguing that they are allowed to keep using nuclear weapon and oil and so on because it's compliant, because they use it to achieve positive things. It's a game that gets played. It's about controlling you, and it's an important conversation. But this goes, as we're overlap for a moment there, your body and the overlaps internally. We've brought up in the past the conversation of whether using a gene modified concept that then modifies you in a way that it can be patented, does that then change you, and how far then does that go, and at what point can they argue you're no longer you and you can be owned by something? I mean, this may sound crazy to some people, but there are very real conversations being had at high levels about exactly that point. And I very possibly could have been part of what was going on during the COVID-19 illusion that hasn't ended, to be quite honest. But absolutely crazy. We also talked about in that show the two-party illusion, the conversation of, using these things. Like, I think one part we talked about was this kind of oscillating of the two-party illusion, where, you go back decades and the left was perceived as more the sane group, and the right was the radical one. And then, it goes back and forth and back and forth. We've already seen one of those from the COVID time to now, where all of a sudden it goes back and forth. But so what's interesting is what we talked about was how we saw that kind of happening more on the right, where suddenly they were being played into taking actions that were, to their detriment, but using a wedge issue or some kind of an emotional issue to get them to think that it wasn't. And it says, this happens to all sides of the two-party illusion. And so I wanted to kind of talk today about that overlap in regard to the SAVE Act and digital IDs. And I just talked about this recently. This was the show I put out. It was entitled The SAVE Act, Real ID, and ID 2020, using the two-party illusion and the election to usher in digital IDs. Now, this is so interesting to me because, as far my research, and I basically sum it up quickly, is that there's an undeniable overlap unquestionable between ID, which the Real ID Act of 2005 was rolled out under the guise of terrorism and that kind of situation, and has simply been kicked down the road, and now it's put off all the way until 2025. Same thing though, and it's changed to what is now Real ID compliant. That has been overlapped many times with ID 2020, which I know you're familiar with, and the idea that this is a digital ID discussion. That's what it's really about. And even within Real ID, you can find overlaps of digital ID. And then within the SAVE Act, it's listed very specifically. One of the main examples is Real ID compliant identification. In other words, there were birth certificate examples, passports, and so on. Point being there is that there's, I think it was 48%, 53%, half the country doesn't have one or the other. Right. And so either way right there, you're going to have people driven into the digital ID infrastructure. My point is simply that at what point, when they know where we all see it going, digital IDs are clearly what they're driving, when they then say, okay, these are all we'll accept, and then that simply gets amended. And it's too late now. You've already passed it. It's already there. It's easy to amend these things without any involvement, which I don't know, everything is easy in Congress without involvement from the people, in my opinion. But my point is that I'm worried that people are missing this. And I would say on top of it that I mentioned last time, I argue that the general premise of the SAVE Act, I agree with. I think it's important to make sure that Americans are the ones voting and nobody else, but we need to be careful that it's not a Trojan horse. So what are your thoughts on that?
So I've thought quite a bit about this, and I actually, when I went to the state capitol, I've been several times this year. The one time was to speak on the natural asset companies, which are moving towards climate smart commodity projects. That's been in the work for a long time. I think they kind of derailed that a little bit. And now they're really aggressively moving forward with that. And that is tied to the ESG and all of that. But the other one was on the voucher system, the school choice issue and the voucher, the Education Freedom Scholarship Act, and to really push back against that. And that agenda goes back several decades. Charlotte Iserbyt was probably the most, vocal whistleblower. She was under the Reagan administration. She blew the whistle on the BEST project, but she talked about the whole, World Core curriculum, which is known in the United States as Common Core. She called it Communist Core. But it comes from Robert Mueller. Robert Mueller was assistant secretary general to the UN. He worked for the UN for 38 years, I believe. And he had this whole 2,000 ideas plan, which actually ended up being 7,000 ideas. But he literally said it was all about creating global citizenship and, putting every child into a computer. But he said that the whole education system would then be predicated on the works of Alice Bailey. Of course, Alice Bailey is the disciple of Madame Blavatsky. She was she had an ascended master, Joel Kuhl, who told her that it would be her mission in life to execute the plan of the Masons to create a one world religion. And she was the one who formed the Lucis Trust in 1923. It was in a year earlier. It was called Lucifer Publishing. A little on the nose. So they changed that. But Madame Blavatsky's paper was called Lucifer Magazine. So, but he says that it's going to be based on her works and, her plans. And you can go right to the Lucis Trust website, and they outline from her externalization of the hierarchy, the 9-step plan for the New World Order. It looks like that is what's being carried out. So I went to go and speak to them on, to fight against the agenda. And I actually told a group of moms who were standing outside, because they were talking about like the voting and everybody needs ID. And I think they thought I was super crazy when I said it. And I said, I'm a little concerned about this because it's not on principle. I don't disagree. Obviously, you should be a citizen in order to vote. And
it is the law, right?
Yeah, right. But I said, but I know the Hegelian dialectic and I know how they play these games. And I'm very concerned that there are people waking up to, things like sovereign citizenship. They go by different names, right? And some of them really are scams. But some of them are really just reading the natural law. And, hopefully you find somebody who's really guiding you through that process, or you're versed in natural law and you're able. Yeah, exactly. It's very extensive. So I'm very concerned because I think there are more people who are, going on that path and they're, renouncing their citizenship. They're giving up their birth certificates, various documentation.
In the sovereign citizen direction?
Yes.
Interesting. Okay.
And I'm concerned now that these are people who are, wanting to be, that they're in the freedom camp, right? And they're anti-establishment, for lack of a better word. But I'm concerned now that a lot of those people are going to be they're being led and steered.
Mhm.
And then now they're going to clamp down. They'll do a bait and switch, and they'll suddenly require this, the paperwork for voting.
Right,
And
right.
now all those people won't qualify. So how would they vote? And think about it, right?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if you think about how would those people vote versus the people who are, following the straight and narrow
Mhm.
path. And this is not to say that I agree on one side or the other. It's not about that. It's that I can see how it would be weaponized against them.
Exactly. And the whole point is that the most successful manipulations use something that people care about.
Exactly.
Something that we do want, right? And so then they get you voting on something, usually with a rider or some kind of add-on that you don't notice. But this is just, I think this is a little bit more surreptitious. It's listed right within it. But it's easy to fall into that trap because you do want this,
Yeah.
And you make a great point there, excuse me, that I brought up in like the whole point being that obviously we should care about whether citizens are voting and whether somebody else in the world is trying to, or other people that aren't, that matters.
Right.
And if you disagree with that, that's okay too. You can have an discussion about why you think that shouldn't be the case. I have to point out that the fact that someone like Elon Musk posted this and said, you're a traitor to the country if you don't agree with this bill. That's the kind of poisonous division that I see ever. It's crazy because I agree that we should support it, but to say that it's dangerous. But my other side of that is that we should also care if there's even just a few people that are somehow boxed out and unable to vote. It is their right. And so we should care about both sides of that. And neither small, even I think both sides are small in a larger conversation, but they both matter, And so now we're at a point, as you're highlighting, where it's not even being discussed, where you have people that are leaning into more of a, which is their right as well, sovereign citizen direction, omitting, getting rid of these documents. And then even at the current level, they're not allowed to, or not able to vote.
Yeah.
And, it's an interesting conversation because if we're going to argue that that we should make sure, however, that only people are voting are citizens, how do you regulate that? How do you ensure that? And so there's a fair question to be had there. I argue that you don't need digital IDs and technology to do that. I think there's easier ways to do it.
Yeah.
You could have a website where somebody enters in their social security number. You know what I mean? Like, even though that's technology, either way, the point is that driving us in a direction that is removing all of those things, which I clearly see is obviously weaponized.
Yeah. Well, I personally think that, so many like legal citizens, they go through a process where they actually have to take a test and they learn about the history, they learn civics, and most Americans are completely oblivious to any of that because we've had such a poor education system.
And most of what we're taught is false.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So much of what they know just isn't so. Yeah. But I think that's by design. But I think, and I know people probably think this is crazy, but I personally wouldn't be opposed to some sort of, like, everybody is required to take some sort of a test in order to be able to vote, to prove that they actually know the history, they understand what their role is, why they're voting. What is the history of the system that's been set up? Why do we even have a vote? I agree with, I understand where the intention comes from, but you would also probably immediately agree how easily that could be weaponized right away. I would argue though that any barrier on what is somebody's right, I think is a problem. Like at the end of the day, even though I agree the sense is that there are a lot of people that don't even understand what they're doing. And so you're coming from a place where it's like, look, it's important to know what you're voting for, know what matters. To earn the right. Right. But, but I would always fall back on the extreme level of it where, it's take your right to free speech, the same point, it's where it's well, you should have to learn what to say before you can speak because that, like same kind of, it could be weaponized, know? I think those are very different. Oh, I agree. I agree. I'm just making a point, but I think that it's clear that there is always an effort to try to manipulate the things that are genuine and important, and so bringing it back to the point about voting in general, the digital ID aspect, what I think is interesting, there's two things, is that the Republicans were easily the most resistant group out of the two-party illusion paradigm conversation, more resistant to that during, the height of it than the left, right? And so that as this has changed over time, I think that's still generally the same for the left conversation, that they argue, vaccine passports or whatever. And now you've got a point where they're convincing the right in a different way. And even once we realize it, my point is now you've got this real majority who in one way or another actually might agree to going in this direction. And I think that's what the whole point is using them to eventually get the agenda while both sides play a part in achieving that. Totally. And I think this is the Hegelian dialectic. This is what they do every time. And this is actually the conversation that I had on the school choice voucher because Anthony Sutton does a really great job of this. So a lot of his material came from Charlotte Iserbyt's father and grandfather were both members of Skull and Bones.
Mm.
So she had access to like the, Rolodex and
really?
the little black books. Yeah.
Interesting.
Which,
That'd be interesting to
and
look
they
at.
had already been in communication on the research he had done on the Soviets. So he attained that material, and he outlines how the Order of Skull and Bones took over the education system and how they control the education system and how they weaponize the Hegelian dialectic. And I mentioned this when I was because they kept saying to me when I was at the talking to the state legislators, they were like, "We're the Republicans, we're the good guys. I don't know why you're arguing with us." And I said,
they actually said that out loud?
Yeah, they actually said that out loud. And I said,
Ridiculous.
I don't really care if you have an R or D in front of your name or in front of the bill. My concern is, are you stripping parents of their rights? Are you increasing government spending? Are you raising the taxes?
Right.
Are you limiting the freedoms of the parents and to educate their children as they see fit?
Right.
And that is what I'm concerned about, not the label. And so I explained to them, I said, there's something called the Hegelian dialectic, and they're
probably falling for it.
Yeah. I was very polite about it, but I kind of, and they said, you're using big words and we don't understand what you're talking about.
Wow.
And
that's scary.
Said, I know. And I said, well, that's not a problem. We can do a 2-minute. I don't need to give you a big, long philosophy lesson. We can do like a 2-minute. This will be fun, just kind of a quick overview of how this applies to what we're discussing here. And Anthony Sutton really does a great job in his book outlining this, but he talks about how they're going to pit both sides against each other. And that is exactly what we're seeing. I mean, that's a really great example of it. So now you've got all these people on the right who are advocating for school choice because they've used these marketing terms like freedom and choice. And, most people who are on the quote unquote right, that resonates for them, but they're not realizing that it's government school choice, and whatever the government funds, it runs. So you're not really given the choice.
Well, and to your point about the we're the good guys, or what they said, that's how that works. They get convinced that, well, because we've got an R next to this person's name, then they're not going to do that. Well, I mean, that may be the case, or what eventually somebody who, if you think that's the truth, which I think is not even remotely the truth, but let's just say that's the case in your mind, what happens when the Democrat gets voted in down the line?
Yeah.
The point is you're putting that power in a centralized position for government to use.
Yep.
This is why I'm always talking about, don't look at it left and right, which I know is on deaf ears for most of the country, but it's your government doing these things. If we can actually stand back and look at it as your government and just hold them accountable as a whole, then you wouldn't, they couldn't be able to use these against you, but that's a scary thing to think about. These are people in positions of power that are just the most childish narrative we're the good guys, it's just, I think that's so crazy to me. I don't even know how to explain that any better.
I told them, I said, I almost think it would be better if we had a Democrat governor, because all these Republicans are carrying water for our quote unquote Republican governor who's trying to pass these bills that are horrendous.
So they push back more on the governor if it was a Democrat.
I found that with this, the Education Freedom Scholarship, the people who were asking the best questions were actually the Democrats, because they were already put in a position where we're supposed to fight this. And so they were scrutinizing the material, whereas a lot of the Republicans had barely even looked at it, and they just pass it through. And it's not that I agree with all these Democrats on a lot of issues. A lot of them I don't, but I actually told them right up front. I said, you were asking real good questions.
Right.
These are hard, issues, and you were bringing things to the forefront that need to be addressed or at least examined.
Right.
And I told them I really appreciated that. I may not agree with them on a lot of other things, but I think once you're being pit against each other, and that's just it, people fall into these identity, politics, and that's the problem.
It is, and it's so, if you're in a position where you simply think that because they're left or right, that therefore there is no problem, like, you're missing the bigger picture. I mean, it's as simple as that. The other thing I was going to mention was the same time this is happening again, as I perceive it, I'm sure it's certainly possible I could be wrong. The UK is pushing openly on the surface. We need digital IDs to stop the migration or the immigration. And I'm like, how can, and they pushed this through like right on July 4th, which I don't know if it's relevant, but I thought it was interesting. But the point is that you can see at the same exact time, they're arguing we have the same problem. Over here, they're just like, here, we need this bill that's not about digital IDs at all, even though it uses digital ID overlap or the Real ID Act. The UK is going, we need digital IDs, just right on the surface. I think it's obvious they're both driving at the same thing. And as somebody, go ahead.
I was just very quickly going to say, well, this is incrementalism, right? Because we look back at even just the passport requirement. This goes back to 1913. That's not that long ago.
Right.
What was going on in 1913, right? That's also when the Federal Reserve Act, the Income Tax Act.
Right.
This is the First World War. This was Woodrow Wilson, who was the first New World Order president, or to publicly say he was advocating a New World Order. And he was advised by Tavistock and the Creel Commission. Edward Bernays and Walter Lippmann were overseeing him to create a propaganda campaign to convince Americans that the Tariff Act, the reducing the tariffs was a good idea, and that we should have quote unquote free trade, which actually created what we're now seeing. I mean, back then it was a little bit different, but what we're now seeing, the rise of the manufacturing in China and exportation of all of our manufacturing in the United States. It was not good for America. The tariffs actually helped create borders, economic borders. And they were also instrumental in convincing the Americans that this great Christmas present of the Income Tax Act was going to be good for us.
Gosh, think about all the stuff that happened right there. You never, income taxes, they'll defend that forever, but the country was fine before that happened. Yeah. And the idea as well that, as I understand it, it was about 1918 and the Kansas or Spanish flu where the passports became like, okay, from here forward, we have to use them. So it's a good point to think about using the COVID vaccine passport, the same agenda, the same attempt. And, is what I said just the other day, which is fascinating, is you think about the time of that. Now we go, yeah, of course, passports, because we've used them for so long. Right, exactly. But think about when that happened, where you're thinking, okay, before this, I didn't need to do that. Now all of a sudden they're like, you need to register, you need to have your name and your picture, and you have to show this or picture. I don't know if that was the capping at the beginning, but and people were like, wait a minute, that's not freedom, that's not liberty. Right. And it's the same damn thing again, and they're trying to convince you that it's for the same reason. It just never stops. I was going to point out the weaponized migration. Somebody just pointed out in the chat again. My whole point on this is that I think that this is important. And I think that I've talked many times about how obvious and real and in-your-face weaponized migration is long before the creation of the United States. Yeah. We've seen it through the United States foreign policy, Israel's foreign policy. We've seen it UK, but it's something that's commonly used. So we should very much care about that, but that doesn't mean we should go, well, digital IDs in order to fight weaponized migration. It's like we need to recognize that we're being played. My point would be, if you have a problem with this, scream about Speaker Johnson and everybody involved with pushing through. They don't need to put Real ID Act in there to make this happen. There's plenty of other ways they could verify what your citizenship is, and this is deliberate, in my opinion. Other ways. Yeah. But I think this is like the Fabian socialist incrementalism. It's like they slowly give us these different things to get acclimated to. And like you said, people don't question passports anymore. And I was questioning it recently because I went to Geneva in the end of May, beginning of June. I was part of like the, combating the WHO. There was a global think tank that I was a part of. And I was like, the whole process of passports, where did that even come from? And I was like, I don't think this is, a really old, I'm sure at some point people didn't have passports and we survived, Yeah. So I started looking into that, and but now we would not think of not having a passport. That's just, we're so conditioned. Well, think about how weird it is when you really think about let's just say you're an American, you're in the United States, and you just were like, I don't want to be here anymore. Right. And you don't have a passport. You can't leave. I know. That's kind of crazy. But what right do they have to say you're not allowed to leave the country? Like, what? I want to live in Australia for the rest of my life. Right. And they're going to say, no, you can't until you register with us before you leave. Yeah. That's pretty interesting. That's very clear. Like, that is not in my mind synonymous or, the same as freedom and liberty. It's not. But no. Danger, terrorism, and we all fall back into it. Kind of ironic. It's the very people who claim that they want a worldwide peace and a more integrated, unified world. But they create all these boundaries that we're not allowed. And that's been written too. I mean, the futurist architects, Kissinger's and Brzezinski, they talked about that, how they would create these nation states intentionally to create the rise of nationalism to subvert it. Yep. Well, that's a two-part. We just what we started with, right? And so you get one side calling for literally no borders at all, and everyone on the other side going extreme nationalism borders, and they're all kind of aiming somewhere in the middle, to keep that. It's always the same agenda, And to bring that to another thing I think is interesting. This has to do. I've seen a very clear overlap with a lot of this in regard to Twitter, Elon Musk. I think he's playing a very central role in sort of driving what you just described, like this new kind of technocratic nationalist direction. His father was literally the president of Technocracy Inc. in 1933, right? At Columbia University. So yeah. Well, you'll find this especially interesting. I think this was from today. He says, well, first, this person, I'm not familiar, looks like an executive vice president of the European Commission for the EU, fit for digital age and, digital overlap. It says, in our view, Twitter doesn't comply with the DSA in key transparency areas. It misleads users, fails to provide adequate and written ad repository, and blocks access to ad for research and blah, 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 and talking about the Digital Service Act. In no way am I saying I agree with these people or what they're doing or support it at all. But the point is that what he responded to him and said, the European Commission offered Twitter an illegal secret deal, which again, I wouldn't be surprised at all, but let's realize this is just him saying this online. We have no evidence of that yet. So just like every Twitter files and everything else, we have to be objective. But it says, if we quietly censored speech without telling anyone, they would not fine us. The other platforms accepted that deal, which if true is a big deal. That's a huge, that's showing. I don't think anybody's under the illusion these groups are honest. I think we all know that they play government in general. But what do you think about that first? Just him saying that. What does that register with you?
So you're saying that they're the transparency areas that don't comply.
They're basically saying that they're not meeting the standards necessary for advertising. The European Commission and in general, like allowing this to exist, and they're saying basically that what he's doing is, the transparency areas, adequate ad repository, block access, whatever they're saying there. Basically, they're saying that there's a problem, so they're going to take action. And he's simply saying that they offered him a deal to say, as long as you do what we want and censor what we want, we won't bother you.
Well, I think where this is all going is, they're doing their Summit of the Future in September, and this is based on they're going to vote on the Digital Global Compact, and Antonio Guterres has been saying how we have a real problem with safety on the internet. And of course, by safety, what he means is that we need to censor more. We need to regulate hate speech, and misinformation is a huge problem.
Of course.
And so, of course, they're talking about ways that we can combat that. And this means more regulation. And I have a huge problem with that.
Oh, yeah.
That's very, very concerning. And I've read the AI World Society plans. This is the UN 100 that they partnered with Boston Global Forum. It was Michael Dukakis, the former governor of Massachusetts, wrote this book, Remaking the World, The Age of Global Enlightenment. And I've been doing kind of a dive on the spiritual roots and underpinnings of the UN, which is now the World Economic Forum. They partnered in 2019. So it's, as I had mentioned about Alice Bailey, I mean, she started the Lucis Trust, which was the spiritual consultancy, and still is to this day, to the UN. And so I really think this book, Remaking the World, The Age of Global Enlightenment, when they say enlightenment, they don't mean like, the Enlightenment period. They mean the Enlightened One. And it does look like the Enlightened One is going to be some sort of a cyber Satan. And this whole plan is to create, they talk about creating, it is the global brain. Which is really interesting because right now there seems to be these two camps, and talking about dialectics again, it seems like there's a one camp that claims that they are anti-transhumanism, which is really interesting because those people happen to be disciples of Barbara Marx Hubbard, who is a transhumanist. She even said that like Christ was transhuman. It's crazy. In her Into Armageddon was that book where she talks about it. I have the quote.
Interesting claim.
I know. But she's very much a transhumanist. And but her disciples claim that they are not. And they claim that we are already, it's more of a Jungian concept. We're already in a global collective conscious. But we need to evolve that consciousness into the superorganism of humanity.
Weird.
It's very, very weird. Yeah. Bruce Lipton, who is he's one of the evolutionary leaders, or part of this New Thought cult. But he actually talks about how his Barbara Marx Hubbard has this like wheel of co-creation. It's just this very Gnostic kind of view. They think that Mark Gaffney, who is one of these disciples, actually says that we are going to be the savior for God. And this goes back to kind of like the Neoplatonic kind of concept that like, God is, he can't know himself. And so, it's the panentheistic concept that we can help him to know himself. And this is, of course, how we're going to save him.
But this is some deep, like very abstract, like that doesn't even make much sense other than like now, like how are they meaning this literally? I find it hard to believe.
Yeah, no. They mean it literally. Unfortunately, it's very literal. It is a lot to unpack. It sounds just totally cuckoo crazy. I actually just broke down on my last a recent show. This book is called Cosmoerotic Humanism. And this is Mark Gaffney, Zach Stein, and Kenneth Wilber. And the three of them together make up David Temple. I don't know how, but somehow they make David Temple, and that's the pseudonym that they go by. But that's this book that they wrote.
It's probably like a meaning in there, I think, with that.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think it might be a relative, like they're referencing like Paul Temple. I have theories on it, but I don't know enough to know yet.
Or just the fact that three of them are the one kind of a.
Oh, they're the temple, the Godhead.
Yeah.
That's you might be right. I there might be something to that. So, but that camp claims that they're anti-transhumanism. But then there's the other that are like the Kurzweilians. And Kurzweil just, he's releasing his new book that's, we know the singularity is near, and now he talks about the singularity is nearer. And he claims that the singularity is going to occur in 2045. And I find this really fascinating because when is the UN 100 plans for the AI World Society? It's the centennial of the UN, which is 2045. But the reason I say I think it's a dialectic is because, and I don't know that maybe the Mark Gaffneys and Zach Steins are genuine. I don't know. I don't fully trust them. Mark Gaffney is like a convicted pedophile, and I won't make any allegations here. But if you want, you can watch the Dr. Phil episode where his vindication, his alibi rather, is that she was 13 going on 30, and so therefore, it's not a But that aside, if we're already in a global brain, it's really easy to just have the technology that just makes that easier, right? Where the other people actually believe, like Kurzweil, believe that the technology is what's going to create the global brain. And I brought up Bruce Lipton. He says that we do co-create, and we have the opportunity. We might cease to exist, or we can, as humanity, choose to evolve. And he says we start out as like this, amoeba, single-celled organism, and then we evolve and we become like these complex multicellular organisms as humans. And he says what makes the amoeba so intelligent is the membrane. That's where it collects all its information. And that's why humans are so intelligent, because we have so much membrane, so much surface area to collect all this information and intelligence. But he says now we can choose to co-create, and we can evolve together into a superorganism of humanity. But what does he say is going to be that membrane? It says the internet.
Weird. I mean, it's I'm sure you would need to, like, we could probably spend the entire conversation talking about this, and it would still be hard to really grasp how that makes, it's sort of abstract. But here's what I would see that I just read the subtitle here, which is funny that we've talked about this so many times, and it's still perceived in most of the conversation to be some kind of a fake idea. But it says, ready to blend your brain with the cloud and put nanobots in your bloodstream. It's like, oh my God. It's like, if only people would start listening to our warnings about how this is literally already happening. Yeah, it's just a crazy concept.
I mean, you all know, Rory kept saying 2020 is the year that, that goes under the skin, right?
Yeah. Actually, I think I have that.
Skin. Well, in the AI world society, so that's why I'm saying I think that the abstract stuff is to try to appeal to the people who overtly don't like the idea of transhumanism, but then they can lure them in that way. Because this is just a concept. We're just spiritually evolving, and it seems it is very abstract, and it seems innocuous. But then when you look at the AI World Society plan, they talk about 6G. They literally, I mean, the UMass study already said that
Trump
humans are going to be the what?
Trump loves 6G.
Well, that's all another conversation. But they say that humans are going to be the energy that's harnessed for 6G to function. And in the AI World Society, they talk about how we're going to have biosensors all throughout us, and that's going to be connected. So it's essentially the Internet of Things, the Internet of Bodies, the Internet of nano-bio things, right? It's all, and they lay it out in this. So people will say, oh, it's just crazy conspiracy theory. I'm not claiming that it's already happened or that it may, there seems to be evidence in that direction. But I'm telling you, they've laid out these plans that are very concrete. That's where they want to go.
Well, it goes back to that same opening
point. And I think
point.
the digital ID, is all just is the way to get us there.
Absolutely. And so perfect right there, brings that completely full circle. Is it now, like you're highlighting, is that they're using, like, just the first thing I thought of, the way you're framing that. And again, I'm only taking off your kind of overview of it, but that you're giving an opening to, like, this is more religious, spiritual than it is technology. And so you have this door. And so I would see somebody like a Trump coming out and saying, this is the future for Christian, whatever. And suddenly you'd have a lot of people leaning into it from the wrong position, thinking you're going to, somehow, be closer to God, and it's just the same point. It'll use things that we care about to drive you into something both sides are trying to, create.
Yep.
And I just think this is such an alarming overlap. So again, I mean, not to belabor that point, but I think all of this relates to that. And that's seriously the stuff of my nightmares. What you're highlighting right there in the conversations. And these are, what people need to understand is these are real time. These are people, high level people having conversations, writing books, having in seminars. Like this is happening. And I am of the mind very clearly, as I've talked about, that I think the nanotechnology, the smart dust, which I bring this up still, and people look at you like you're speaking some other language. And the smart dust I've shown, and again, I'm open to the idea that this is like, I spoke with Jay Cooey, who I really respect. I think he's a very smart guy.
He's coming on my show in a few weeks.
He's a great guy. I want to connect with him again. And he made the argument that if he's of the mind that this is more of like an illusion, that they're still working towards these things, but they haven't achieved them. And, I get that.
I think there's a little of both.
That's what I'm saying. And I think that even with that being the point, they're still trying. And that worries me. But I see far too much. Full respect to what he's saying. I see far too much out there that worries me that my point was that there is open discussion. There's websites, there's government entities that have worked on smart dust going back decades, like literally talking about testing it in open seas for tracking ships. And, and the guy, his little video showing him sprinkling dust in the air, and it's like, this is going back decades. And now we're at a point where they're going, look at this big thing that we can put in your hand. I'm like, that's BS. Right. They have, like, I played that clip a million times on TLAV about the symposium they had about nanotech going back 20 years. And he says, this is the Mu chip from 10 years ago. And this was a 10-year-old video. So it's 20 years ago. And this thing was, he said like the size, like the 10th of the size of a piece of paper. And it's like, this can land on your skin like dust. It can use your body's power to operate. And this is the DARPA. It's a DARPA overlap. And this is going back 20 years. So, I mean, I'm so worried. I know I've said this so many times, but I'm worried about where we're at right this moment. And then overlapping that with nanotechnology and lipid nanoparticles in the shot. And I'm not saying we know for sure, but that worries the hell out of me with all of the things that we are finding out are dangerous about that thing.
Yeah, I'm with you. It's very concerning.
That's actually a perfect segue to get into the thing I wanted to talk about today, but I wanted to make sure we touched on what you brought up, because I'm actually not as familiar with this as I want to be. Okay. And we talked about, and there was one other tweet that I wanted to share that goes back to that same point that Whitney commented on. I think it's funny. So same tweet from Elon, and Whitney says, actually Michael Schellenberger says, in regard to him saying, we'll stand against this, and that, whatever, that they offered us a deal and we declined. Right. He says, Elon Musk is all that stands between us and totalitarianism. My God.
The messianism, like, really?
Censored News did a whole breakdown on why Michael Schellenberger's been basically shilling for Twitter. You guys can look that up. Yeah. But Whitney says, the Pentagon contractor helping militarize space and brain chip guy. Is that for real?
I mean, he's literally every facet of the fourth industrial revolution. He has a company that's working on it. Like,
it's ridiculous.
Every single facet.
And this is, I guess, same point, using things we care about, and, dropping the Twitter file idea to get you to think we're going to change everything, change the media, and then really just never follow through what they claim. And people just keep pushing the narrative.
Use it as a honeypot. I mean, I think it would be really naive not to think there's a whole data mining project going on there.
I 100% agree with that. I think it's data mining. I think it's like very surreptitious social engineering in ways that we're existing on for platforms and different communities. I see it. I mean, I've even seen differences between other people's things where it's like that shouldn't be the case. It's not about the for you part of it. Like there's very clearly some weird social engineering experiments going on that worries me. So I wanted to make sure we touched on what you talked about Project 2025.
Oh yeah.
Because that relates to this as I understand it in some ways. And Soundwave online recently commented about that and said, do you know about that side of it? And I really want to get into this. So what are your thoughts on that? What is that for people that don't know? And how does it connect to what we're talking about?
So I will just full disclosure, I'm not an expert. It is 1,000 pages long. And so I have not read all 1,000 pages.
They don't want anybody to read it all.
No, that's why they make these things so long and laborious to read, because they don't want people to actually read it. Firstly, I will say this, and this is not, a pro-Trump, anti-Trump statement, but he is not affiliated. And I think they are trying to position it as this is a Trump. Trump has something called Agenda 75. And that's different. It's very, and that's his project.
Has he endorsed this project 2025?
No, he's actually publicly distanced himself.
Definitely being presented otherwise.
Yeah, I know. I know it is. There is a mass line effort that very much through the left, and this is, I know there's the left-right illusion, but this is part of how they play the
they
game.
Exist.
It's to pit people
They're
against.
Real people.
Yeah, exactly. So they are pitting. They're making it look like this is an anti-Trump thing, but Trump himself he has publicly come out and said, I have nothing to do with this.
Mhm.
This is, there's a lot of companies who are, or organizations, rather, entities that are involved. But some of the very big ones are like the Heritage Foundation, who's kind of spearheading this. There is I personally am not somebody who really trusts the Heritage Foundation. They have played a lot of dialectical operations previously throughout history. So, they play themselves as a front, being a very conservative outfit. A lot of the things they have advocated and composed are not conservative at all. So I'm a little bit, suspicious of that. Then there's the Koch brothers, and I don't think I need to really elaborate there. There's like Claremont, who's been very involved in integralism projects, and to go back to the religious conversation, there's I think, and this is my opinion, but I do think that they need to, they've talked openly, when you read the writings of I call them parasite class, not the elites, but
definitely, elitists.
But when you read their own words, they talk about the desire to have a one world religion. And of course, I think it's easier once you have a one world religion. Now you have people very invested in a mindset, and it's much easier to, they're more susceptible to programming, manipulation, and to social engineering.
Right.
And so they want to have a one world religion to usher us into a centralized, worldwide governing body. And so there is kind of this, theosophical push. And I had mentioned Blavatsky and Bailey. Of course, Blavatsky actually formalized the Theosophical Society in 1875. A lot of the members of Theosophical Society were Fabian socialists. Theosophy, I think, precedes it much. Yeah.
And what's the society? What is that? Can you describe that?
The Theosophical Society. So she formulated this in 1875, and she says it's not a religion. It's a philosophy, and it's he calls it the perennialist philosophy. So it's this idea that we incorporate all religions and basically make it like a soup. So there's it's
interesting idea.
Yeah, it's the blurring of all boundaries. There's there's no distinction between one religion or one denomination. The only thing she says is that this is her own words. She does say it's diametrically opposed to Christianity. So,
what? Well, that doesn't make sense then.
Everything else is fine, but Christianity is a bit of a problem. Yeah, you Christians are problematic. She is openly Luciferian, and satanic. She openly says it's a Gnostic perspective. So, from their perspective, Lucifer is the enlightened one who is freeing humanity, because God was a malevolent God who trapped us and withheld the gnosis, the knowledge that would free humanity. And it's the Genesis story essentially inverted, and the snake and the serpent become the good guy. But this is very much what they subscribe to. And I will just preface this by saying I may not agree with this worldview, but I don't think everybody involved is inherently an evil person. I think it's the religion of love and light. I mean, who doesn't like love and light,
Well, I love that you said that too, because this is just basic objectivity, right? Like, we have to be clear that, somebody could be, like, for example, not everybody in the military wants to go over and kill everybody in their countries, right? They go through because they believe they're doing something good. It doesn't change the fact that they're actually not, right? I just had a great interview with Brad Miller, who I know same conversation. But, so that's interesting because, I can clearly argue as I'm a Christian myself, that I think that's, blasphemous and, but at the same time, that there could be people that are in that believe that they found some new, it's a great thing. That's why you brought it up. It really does overlap with what we just described, where they think that they're like, the new step of enlightenment, and, and they're just getting tricked into, or by something into, something that is not in line with what they believe. Exactly. It's fascinating. But what I thought was interesting is, when I was a kid, I had a thought that was like, I forget how young I was too. And I remember thinking this, going like, I think my mindset is that there was some kind of an entity that went around the world, and that each religion is just their interpretation of that, which doesn't really line up with what we think happened and so on. Sure. But it's an interesting thought. Is it is it really just the way we perceive the same teachings? That there are, especially with Abrahamic religions, there's clear overlap, and so you could make an argument that putting them together might be some kind of a unifying thing, but I don't necessarily think that. I get the idea, but at the same time, you can see how that, as all things we talk about, is probably being weaponized against people in order to drive them into something that they would think they're doing good, but really not, and that's the kind of the whole premise.
Yes. Well, so the perennialist concept is that there's elements of truth in all religions, and I think that statement has a lot of merit. I mean, you look through even through the pagan religions, and there's a lot of similarity in the themes, in the allegories, and the messaging. A lot of overlap, and there's a lot of because I think personally, I believe there's absolute truth, and they're all picking up on that, and they're all relaying kernels of that. And of course, as humans, we don't have the all-seeing eye, so we're just trying to use our reason and our intuition to try and discern whatever we can to find our path to the absolute truth. So I think but when they're they want to dissolve all the boundaries, and that's really what it's about, because they believe that, it's all about the one. It's a monism, kind of a monistic kind of concept. They're not monistic and believing in a single deity, but monism in that there is no separation between any of us, that we all, they worship the Mother Earth. This is where the Gaia religion stems from. They worship Mother Earth, but it's panentheistic because they believe that we have the opportunity, we can co-create with Mother Earth. And so essentially God is within each of us, and we become God.
It's danger. It's for a lot of people that is dangerously coming up to a line of what would be considered blasphemous, like where you're suddenly the one that is God, as opposed to,
well, it's an inversion. Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's horrific. I mean, there's a reason the capital G Gnostics, I differentiate between little G Gnosticism and capital G, but there's a reason the capital G Gnostics were, considered heretics.
Well, what's interesting is what you described, and we've talked about before, is it sort of overlaps with what, like Malthusian kind of, like doing wrong and achieving good through that kind of a weird, that's what it seems like, to where you can, I think a lot of this, my gut tells me, is driving people into a position like we just discussed, where you are, leaning into their sort of like dark perspective on the world, but convincing you that you're doing it for a positive reason. And I think that's everything we're talking about. Do you see any overlap with that in regard to like the medical, mark of the beast kind of COVID-19 overlap, anything in that conversation?
I see a lot. There's actually a lot of theosophy in the medical freedom movement. And I think that's a way that they can kind of bring those people into their end goal. And
I would say really quickly that none of this stuff are we implying that those movements are inherently wrong, but they're just in some ways being manipulated from within. I think that applies to everything we're talking about.
Yes.
So good. Just want to make that clear.
Yeah, no, I agree with that 100%. But yeah, I think it's really, a lot of them are invested in, what you would call like an immunization of the eschaton, trying to bring about the end times, and to serve their ends, because they want to bring the Antichrist. That's what I did a show on World Invocation Day. I mean, that's literally what it's about, summoning the Lord Maitreya. And they talk about, we're seeing this so much in the media right now, right? The Christ consciousness. That phrase, I mean, that comes right out of, like, Rudolf Steiner talks about it, Madame Blavatsky talked about it. When they talk about Christ consciousness, it's this panentheistic concept. They don't believe that Christ was a God or, the Messiah. They believe that it's just another world teacher like Buddha or Krishna or Lord Maitreya. And so when they say Christ consciousness, they're really talking about the, you being God, the God within you.
Right.
And so to bring this full circle, it's very relevant because they want to, blur all these boundaries. Although, they talk about Mother Earth, the Gaia religion. Now they're talking about universe religion. That we're going to go from Homo sapiens to Homo universalis. It's a very weird concept.
A lot of grand, like what's the term? Delusions of grandeur. It seems like a lot of this.
Well, I mean, they think they're God. So, there's that. But when you blur all of these boundaries, and now people have no sense of their own religion, it's just to whatever serves this kind of panentheistic goal. And so we can co-evolve, co-create, and we can evolve as a super organism of humanity. And, those who are not quite evolved enough are just going to have to be swallowed. And this, again, the Malthusian principle, there's no room for those useless leaders.
Right.
But I think that the reason I brought that up was because in Project 25, the integralism is part of this movement to combine so that you don't have, there's like the Parliament of World Religions, and this integralist movement is very involved in that. The Parliament of World Religions started in 1893, the Chicago World's Fair. And it was a movement to bring all of, to bring harmony between all these religions. They really kicked things into gear again in 1993. And they've been going kind of full force ever since. And they have even like the ayahuasca worshiping part of this.
What does that have to do with? That's so interesting because So it doesn't appear to be any front-facing like religion aspect to this. So it's all about politics and bringing politics.
Claremont is one of the backers in this. Like, so you can go through like who are we, and you have all these companies. So I brought up like the Heritage Foundation, the Koch brothers, Claremont, Hillsdale, and I've got Hillsdale. I think is another one of these dialectics. It looks like a their whole mission statement was about taking no government money, and all of their charter schools take government money. So I think Whitmer endorsed them, and so I think unfortunately there's been a bit of a co-option there.
Well, what I'm saying though is that you're saying there's a very clear religious overlap to this, right? What you're saying?
Well,
it doesn't seem to be present on the front of this in any way, which is interesting and telling. Yeah.
But when you look at the people who are involved, they're all about, they have this integralist agenda. So that's just part of it. But the other part of what I'm concerned about with 2025 that is much more overt is a lot of the things that they say that they will do are things that I think a lot of conservatives are going to be cheering for. They're going to say, this is great. We want this. But when you look at how they're going to do it, they're doing it through the executive branch, the executive apparatus, and that it's blatantly unconstitutional.
Yep.
And if you claim to be a conservative, and personally, these labels unfortunately become like target audiences for marketing, and they have very little, value, inherent intrinsic value anymore. But they do have ideological and philosophical roots. And if you adhere to that and you subscribe to that label of being a conservative, then you can't say like, let's stomp on the Constitution when it's doing things that we like. That doesn't work that way. What happens when, let's say you love Trump and he does all these great things, but what happens when he's not in office and somebody you don't like is using the same, path to achieve their goals? Well, now you set a precedent for that.
Exactly.
And it's talking about things like gutting the whole,
Oh, sorry. No, I just had a thought when you brought that up. Go ahead. Finish your thought.
They're gutting a lot of the, like agencies, and that on the face of it sounds great, but they're doing it through the executive branch. And
that's constant, the centralization of power. I mean, I made a huge push about this.
Vitiates the checks and balances that our whole system of government was
checks and balances that we all pretend hold everything together. You're right, though. It's important if you believe that that's still being adhered to, right? But it's clearly been broken.
Well, that's just going to further erode it.
Exactly.
If we have any semblance of it.
Well, and that's the problem is that I made a big push about this, I don't know, years ago, from Obama's time and Bush's time, like the idea that they kept increasing both the memorandum of order or something like that, but then also executive orders. There's two different terms, but both of them are simply something that I argue is completely, it is unconstitutional. You're going directly from the executive branch and just mandating down, which, by the way, should only apply to the executive branch, but they use this to pass laws as they see it. And so that's crazy that it's kept happening more. One thing I wanted to comment before we move on to the next point was as you just highlighted, Donald Trump and the whole legal aspect, which I completely agree. He's being politically persecuted, which I also agree that he is a criminal, like all of them are, but both those things can exist. But what's funny is that what's important is that during this last, basically the Supreme Court, and I think Sotomayor is the one that wrote this important kind of dissenting opinion, which of course, because, there's left and right and everyone ignores the ones they don't like, but she made a good point that regardless of why, that this has set the precedent that the president is no longer legally accountable for its actions, for the person's actions. The point is the same, is it doesn't matter whether Trump is in fact being persecuted. They use it to set this precedent. Then now going forward, they can do pretty much what they want, which they already have been doing. But now there's just one more legal protection. And it's just, I know we've beaten this dead horse for the opening of the show, but it's like, the whole show, it's been an hour, but the point is that it's clear that they're using things that we actually would want or care about to drive in the same things. And that is the government, not the left or the right.
My favorite, you'll appreciate this. I went to the Red Pill Expo, and G. Edward Griffin, who he's just amazing, but he's truly a legend. He's in his early 90s and he's sharp as a tack. He's really awesome, very inspirational. But he said how politicians are con men. And that part I think we can all kind of feel. But then this part was hilarious. He said, and I've never met a con man I didn't trust. It's so true. Like, that's what they do. It's the confidence man, right? They've instilled confidence, and then you trust them. And that's how this game is played.
Yeah. Instagram just censored our show, by the way. I told you it happened. But the whole point about, as well, is that sociopaths are some of the best, like they have learned how to emulate motion almost better than we can express emotion. You know, so those are the people that you go, man, that guy's a real good guy. He really cares. You know, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, people that's actually a huge misnomer with sociopaths. They always say that a lot of people think sociopaths lack empathy.
Yeah.
It's not that they lack empathy; it's that they're not bound by it, but they recognize it. And they're able, because they have such, even more so than most people actually, and they recognize it, and so therefore they're able to utilize it to serve their ends.
Now, are you arguing that they, or and you're probably more well versed in this than I am, but so that they are able to emulate? Are you saying that they feel it, or just they recognize it, they know how to acknowledge it?
They're not necessarily impacted by it,
right?
But they know what empathy is, and they're able to use it to manipulate.
Right. I mean, the way I understand it,
keen sense of empathy.
It's just that they're able to. It's not like it's irrelevant to them that they recognize that the world. You know, they just see that they realize early that I'm not like everybody else. Like I don't feel the same. I don't care if this happens, but they do. And so you just learn that it's uncomfortable if you don't laugh when they do. If you don't, you know, and so you emulate those things. But it'd be interesting to see if it's more than that. But I mean, I think this is, and the point I always make is that you can show an overlap to the general percentage of sociopaths and psychopaths in the world that generally aligns almost always with the percentage of politicians and people in government. It's easy to look up. It's true.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and they actually even did, I mean, that was part of like MK Ultra studies where they were figuring out how they could not only recognize sociopathy, but they could exacerbate it and create it.
Use it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, I've enjoyed this conversation. Like, I almost don't even want to get into this other conversation. I feel like we should keep fleshing this other one out. But I think that what I was going to talk about today was an interesting development in regard to the COVID-19 conversation. But we can keep talking other things if you'd rather go in that direction, if you'd like, because I was enjoying this.
I'm enjoying it too. We could do both. I don't know. We can flesh this out a little more.
Well, I think what I say we do is we can come back to this or talk about it another. This is because in my opinion, this is a very different conversation about some specific things that will, you know, and all it was is about an interesting development. I'll either talk about in my next show or we'll talk about next time we do this around a new development, or rather an old development, but another identification of how this shot's destroying your immune system. But let's talk more about the overlap to the nanotech kind of transhumanist direction that you brought up, because you had a couple more articles in here that you brought up. And I think what's interesting is this completely dovetails or just is what they're pointing at, right? Yeah. So is transhumanism what they're kind of aiming at when it comes to these like new religious directions?
So that's why I say it's kind of dialectical. Because you do have the camp of the religious theosophical. So, you know, it's I call him Jocelyn Goodwin wrote a history of theosophy, and he differentiates between the theosophers and then theosophists, because it's like everything, they rebrand themselves. And so, you know, just for the sake of it, that yes, there was an actual theosophical society, which is still functioning today. But you know, a lot of the new people will call themselves new thought leaders. It's new thought, you know, versus new age. But new thought is really just theosophy. Just the only difference is a stronger focus on mentalism. So they believe all is in the mind, and that the mind is kind of like the secret, right? You can manifest through your, you know, your imagination, and you can create reality by thinking it into being. But you know, this I use the term like neo-theosophy because like Bruce Lifton, who I talked about before, he claims that they're not Darwinian because they don't like it. But with all of these things, cherry pick, they take the part they like. It's like saying that the neo-Marxists are not Marxists. No, they just reject the part of Marx that they don't find useful to them, you know?
They're still standing on that to do what they're doing.
Exactly. And so the neo-Darwin, I call them neo-Darwinians, but they claim they don't like the natural selection because they say that breeds competition, and competition breeds individuality.
What does it mean they don't like it? They're just like, we don't like this one. Just ignore that.
Yeah, well, they say we have to get rid of that idea because the competition is what's breeding individuality. We can't have individuality because we're going to cease to be as a species, because we need to evolve to the next stage of this organism, the evolved.
I find so interesting about that, though. So they're openly acknowledging there's no justification for not using it. They're just going, we don't want that there because it doesn't work for what we want to achieve. As opposed to like a Darwinist, you know, arguably he discovered what he thinks he's presenting, as opposed to them just going, not this, not that. We want these ones. That's what we want to show you because that's what we want to happen. That's very different than like a genuine. Am I wrong? That's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I see it that way too. But they would probably defend themselves, saying that, well, no, it's because this is the evolution of humanity, and we're going to cease to exist if we
As
don't.
they see it, though, as they want it to be, not that it currently is.
Well, they think that that's how it is. They think we're going to cease to be if we don't co-create and co-evolve.
No, but I agree. But what I'm saying is they're saying that so if we don't do what we need to, this will be a byproduct. It's still not saying that they've like discovered through research the reality of the world, right? It's very different. Well, I find that very interesting.
Well, and what's really fascinating about that is because it's all narrative. And, the more you look into science, I'm not saying there is no science. I think there have been scientific discoveries, and I think there are people with integrity who have, really adhered to a scientific method. However, I went to CERN when I was in Switzerland, and if I hadn't just read, it looks like a demonic temple to me. I mean, that's really, I don't know how else to describe it. But if I hadn't just read this David Temple, like cosmoerotic humanism, I don't think it would have been quite so like glaring to me. But in the cosmoerotic humanism, they talk about how we need to rewrite the story of the universe. We need a new story. And this is a theme we keep
making up what you want.
Yeah. But this is
reimagine the universe, everybody.
Reimagine it. Well, that's what they say. That's what they say. We need a new story.
That's weird.
But where else do we see this? We saw this in Jordan Peterson's ARC, Alliance for Responsible Citizenship. They keep saying we need a new story. We need a better story. And what did Klaus Schwab say? He wrote the Great Narrative. Right. That's right after COVID-19, the Great Reset. Now we need a great narrative. What did Lyotard, the postmodernist philosopher, he talked about meta-narrative and how we have to create these meta-narratives for humanity to essentially be shaped and molded.
Wow.
And so they talk about rewriting the story of the universe, and it's like almost 14 billion years old. And they recognize that a lot of people are starting to question the Big Bang. So they say, well, that's right. We don't really think there was a Big Bang. There are 4 Big Bangs. So they double down. But all this to say that it was like, there's kernels of science, because if all of it was just, nonsense, then you would just rebuke it instantly. But the fact that there's, something to anchor to, you kind of you anchor to that, and then you fill in the gap. But really, very little science was present. It was really all just story and narrative.
Right. But it's so weird that they're putting that right on the surface and saying like we need to create the new direction.
They do.
It just shows these are social engineers, right? I mean, that's all that it comes down to. It's not like some actual discovery that's like an epiphany, that's like, the realization that this is how it is, and let me show you that. That's like a prophet,
right.
As opposed to them just going
they
like,
believe they are, because
they're making themselves prophets.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Ascended Masters speak to them. Ellis Bailey's Ascended Master with Dwal Kul, who helped to write the 24 books. And, one of them was the externalization of the hierarchy. And then, of course, Madame Blavatsky had Kuthumi, who's her Ascended Master.
And who are these? Are these people in spiritual positions?
Yeah, they claim they're the Ascended Masters. But
which means what? Describe that.
Well, it's really hard to describe because they channel them.
Okay. So now,
I mean, you could say they're demons. You could say they really are psychic and they're channeling these people in a different spiritual plane. You could say, I don't know. I mean, it's
so
really hard.
So they claim they're channeling some other entity and then acting. That's pretty interesting. So like trying to see this through the lens of most popular religions. I mean, there are both demonic as well as angelic aspects to that on either side of it. So it's interesting, but that's just, that's fascinating. Like this whole thing seems very interesting to me. And it's, I mean, we've seen different rising and falling of different sort of like religious directions, over the years, like, what was the one, Tom Cruise and,
I think that ties into it. Scientology.
Thank you.
When I was talking about the medical freedom movement, so many of them are Scientologists.
Really?
Yes. And when you look through the history of Scientology, there's so many ties to the intelligence apparatus. Yeah. And I don't think this is different. I think this is, there's just like the umbrella. And that's why I say like theosophers, because it's really about putting everything into the soup of religion so they can create a one world religion.
Well, I think religion has been used as far back as we can look. And in no way does that mean religion is not, that's for each of us to decide our own.
Of course.
But we can prove going back that it's, I mean, even going back to like a very prominent time of like, king's castles, that kind of time frame, like whatever you call it, medieval time, whatever what would be the right term for that?
Dark Ages.
Dark Ages. Well, just some time where you're dealing with like, monarchies and different like the authoritarian leadership. And so you have a royal family,
Right.
and they would ultimately be like, oh, you have a second son, you're going to go be a cardinal or a
Right.
pope. It's like, that doesn't mean they're religious. I know a lot of times that time frame, a lot of people were inherently, but there was a lot of examples of people that did it only for power. And we know in a large period of time, it's written about, where the whole Catholic Church dynamic was a lot just about power.
Yes.
But there were still people that believed in God. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but
Well, and
that's
the
always
very
been the
early
case.
monarchies actually believed that, they were like ordained by God.
Right. Well,
And-
so I think some of them believed that some of them didn't care and it was used to hold
Right.
power. But I
Sure.
think either way, it's clear that that religion has always been a tool to manipulate people for people that see that you care about it. It's the same damn point, right?
Yeah.
And so they use it to try to drive you in a position. I mean, look, during Trump's administration and during the first election, I mean, I legitimately saw posts from people that weren't meant to be funny that would act, and people still believe this, that Trump was sent by God. Like that. I remember that
he's
one
like
of the memes,
a messiah of sorts.
it's alarming. And I saw a meme where
and then there's the other
God's
side where they
hand,
think
like
he's
guiding
the
his hand
Antichrist.
while he was like signing a bill. It's like God
Oh.
reaching over, and I'm just like, God, this is intense. Because how do you argue against that?
Right.
I make the same point about any, like with Israel and the kind of perception of these extreme religious beliefs where like God said, it's like, well, I disagree. You can't have that argument. You can't, because it's like there's no winning. There's like, you're wrong. You're blasphemous. Okay. There's no debate,
Right.
What'd you say a second ago? I missed it.
Then there's the other side where they believe that he's the Antichrist.
Ah, yes.
And that's really interesting too, because as I've been diving into, I actually spent 2 days at Constance Cumby's house.
Who's that?
She was the one who wrote The Hidden Dangers of the Rainbow. She wrote Planned Deception. Like, she blew the whistle on the New Age movement.
Oh, good.
And she's a long time ago, and she was really one of the first to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And her library, I think, has like 80,000 books in it.
Wow.
It's like crazy. It's like a row book, and there's rows behind that book. She has like the original volume from Alice Bailey.
Oh,
and
wow.
Yeah,
Nice.
It was really incredible. But she was talking about, I mean, she's convinced Trump is the Antichrist, that it's he's like been, appointed by this whole New Age movement to lead it. And to me, I mean, it just, I'm not here to tell people what to believe or what to think or, but to me, that sounds as ludicrous as the people who think he's the Messiah. I'm
right.
like, is it possible that he's being used as a pawn and that, do I agree with everything he does?
Mm-hmm.
No. Do I think everything he's done, even the good things are just like somehow like, make him a Messiah? No, but
I would argue though that I agree. I mean, it's the same at either side of it. Doesn't matter what argument. There's not evidence to back up the argument of either side. I don't even know how you would end up proving that outside some kind of like religious experience. But I would argue that just from a basic like fact-based level, that being sent by God would be something that it wouldn't, this is only going from like a religious interpretation of what's supposed to happen when that happens, that it wouldn't be a politician standing there on the ground, right? But so from the Antichrist side, that is what it's supposed to be. Somebody who is presented on the ground and it's like drawing you in for something. But I would still argue though, that from a fact-based perspective, it's just as ridiculous. I mean, we have no evidence to suggest one or the other, but I think either way it is. Well, is she a politically active person? Is she a Democrat? Or is that like where she's coming from with that?
No, she's not. That's what's interesting, right? So, but that's why I do think that somebody got in her ear, because she was all in for Trump until January 6th.
Well, so what is her mindset then, though? What's guiding her opinion of why he's the Antichrist? If it's not like that he's the political problem.
Well, apparently there are a bunch of books on it, and it's just she's following that. That's why I really think there's a concerted effort from both sides to, point him as
one or the other.
Yeah, exactly.
Man,
and to pit
it's
them
always the
against
same
each
thing.
other.
This whole conversation has been just this.
It's all about the dialectic. This is why it's dialectical dissonance.
Exactly.
I mean, really, this is the whole thing.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's and that's part of why I've been diving into these theosophical roots, because it goes all the way back. Really, I think a lot of people go back to Plato, and I would argue more than Neoplatonists, but when you go back further, it's like the ancient Egyptian mysteries, right? Or any of the ancient mystery cults. They were really weaponizing dialectical tactics, but I think Hegel really, made it like a methodology. And he talked about that. He said that because people always think that it's like thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And he actually said that that was actually John Gottlieb Fichte's interpretation of Kant. It was the thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And Hegel himself said he rejected both Kant and Plato's notion of dialectic because it was too abstract. And he wanted something that could be used in order to advance the historicity of man. which the omega point for him was the state. He believed the state equal God. And so, of course,
there you go.
yeah,
Exactly
there,
the same
there
kind of thing
we are.
happening again today. Well, so what then? Why is that usually? What's the word I'm looking for? Why is that? Why is it usually people say that came from his work? If he's saying that he kind of rejected it.
I think because things get watered down and
Yeah,
simplified,
always.
right?
Yeah. Well, now it's just
and he
problem
wrote
action
in
solution is
German.
the common phrasing of
Yeah,
today, and we don't even understand how that ties in with the actual dialectic.
He actually had two phrases for phraseologies for the dialectic, but the most, I think, seminal one would have been the abstract negative concrete. And in German, I did a thread on Twitter, kind of giving the definitions, like the English word and then the kind of German translation. But he described it as being a spiral. So you have abstract negative concrete, and then it spirals upward towards the omega point where the state equals God. And for him, like for people to understand, he really believed that humans could have no freedom without complete subservience to the state. Try to wrap your head around that. I mean, that's like totally oxymoronic.
Yeah.
But the way you evolve up the spiral, which in my opinion looks like a Gnostic Jacob's ladder, because they believe this is, you're getting to the omega point to God, right? And the way you do that is through each spiral is through, it's a word in German. It's really sublation. But like in German, it's this term Aufheben. And it's very oxymoronic because it's on the one hand, it's to cancel and destroy, but on the other hand, to preserve and to lift up. And so this is how that spiral evolves.
There's so many of these, like peace through strength, or like, what's the common one I'm just blanking on right now in regard to the United States, where it's, or just in general, New World Order, which is like the,
we need war to have peace.
Right. Or what's the common through through destruction becomes something, like, what's the term that's like, it's written, God, now I'm blanking on it. But there's so many of these where it's like the clear, like it's opposite. It doesn't seem to make sense, but it just, there's so many of these. Do you think all of this kind of stems back to the same kind of backbone of teaching? Like this is just the same conversation through all these governments, and it's interesting.
I absolutely do. I mean, I think this is how they steer and control. And I think that, it's you have, like, we know about the long march through the institutions, right? What are those institutions? They're the education system, the media, the entertainment, the
order of
religion.
chaos. Somebody just posted it. And I got you, Burning Beard. He didn't see, she posted a different way, but I got it.
Order out of chaos. Yeah.
Right. Because that goes to the bigger, sorry, keep going. I just popped in because he posted it.
But that's definitely, I mean, and that's like the Masonic phrase, right?
Yeah, right. Exactly.
So and then of course the family, but through all of those institutions, what are we seeing being taught? And it is these concepts. We have this very, kind of intentional steering of, the theory of ideas, essentially. And I think I always talk about, like, with philosophy, it's like, how does a philosopher make money? If they're being funded, why are certain philosophers being funded versus others? And Hegel was very, very useful to, I think, the parasite class, because he really came up with a system for, and he believed, it was advancing the historicity of man, and that, there were these world historical figures is what they call them. And he said, like, Napoleon was one of them, but he was very influenced. He was a mystic. He was an alchemist, and he was a hermeticist, and he was influenced by people like Jacob Boehme. And Boehme was very influential on Madame Blavatsky. Like, he was a cobbler, shoemaker. And then he talked about how he had these big, these static moments, right, where it's only through intuition, he was able to achieve gnosis, and he essentially became a psychic and channeled all of these ascended masters. And Blavatsky talks about how he was just such a wonderful mystic. He was inspiring to them all.
Interesting. And, aside from all of the, you're talking about Napoleon still, right?
Oh, no, that was Jacob Boehme.
Oh,
who was
sorry.
Very influential on Hegel.
Oh, got it. I was going to say, despite,
but they seem, it all sounds a little abstract and fringe, but then when you start to realize that, like, these are the people behind the UN.
Right.
It's like, this isn't fringe. These are the people who've created CASEL, the social emotional learning. Like, that's the Fetzer Institute. John Fetzer literally thought he was going to channel and become like the Archangel Michael. I mean, you look at the conversations between his nephew, Bruce Fetzer, and they were talking about creating the logo. Originally, they had this logo that was the Archangel Michael. So I mean, they really, it is religious. Like,
Of
it's,
course.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, you made an excellent, I mean, I haven't thought about this in regard to prophets or whatever,
Yeah.
you know, the philosophers rather,
Yeah.
that like, it is an interesting point. I mean, I don't even know where would I don't think even today there's a place for philosophers in outside of, or I mean, ever
Academia,
really. Like
yeah.
these are people, you don't work at the philosophy store, right? There's
Right,
there's a way
right,
you pay for
right.
this. So people out there are, you know, becoming let's put it this way. If you see things online and, you know, these same kind of things, whether it's a philosopher or some new rising thing that comes out of nowhere online, like that's coming from somewhere. It doesn't
Yeah.
always mean that it's false or even that they know that they're being driven by something that's
But
not
it's often
real.
not organic.
Yeah, you know, and
They're
but that's
being
such an
propped up
interesting
or
thought
funded.
throughout history, like well before the internet even. Like,
Yeah.
where did these philosophers come from? Like, who made sure that they were prominent? How did that become something? It wasn't just always organic, if ever. You know?
I don't think it was.
Interesting. Yeah.
I mean, I really don't. Yeah, I was a philosophy major actually. So, I mean, I never thought I would actually use my major. It was like, well, this is a really useless major.
Right.
But ironically, I actually use it quite often these days.
Well, this has been a very interesting conversation. I mean, I just think that it's so obviously, as you could tell, it wasn't we weren't intending to focus
sorry.
on. No, I mean, this is such an important understanding, like to see the point we started with. I mean, everything we've talked about throughout the entire conversation, that there are powerful entities, as I don't need to tell anybody listening, that are out there trying to use everything they can to drive you, not only to take an action that they want that will benefit them, but to get you to think you made that choice.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just what everything is about.
Well, and this is if I can share about the
absolutely.
conference. So I'm doing so I'm doing Cognitive Liberty Conference, and I'm hoping it's a series of many. I'm hoping we can do in-person events. I do think it's so important because part of how they are able to control and manipulate us is by atomizing us. I think it's so important that we do things that are in person. The first day is actually going to be only live stream. That's just due to the venue. Both of them. The second day does have in-person availability, but it's very limited. It's just due to the venue. But there are in-person tickets for the second day. But the first day is focused on education. It's all around this concept. It's cognitivelibertyconference.com. That's the website. But the first is on education. It's on what, Charlotte Iserbyt called the deliberate dumbing down of America. And I would really apply that to the whole West. It's not just the United States, although the United States is a huge target.
Right.
And it's how, they've exported this Prussian model to the United States to militarize us and to rob us of our creative genius. There was the George Land study that turned out to be for NASA. They were trying to recruit creative geniuses. And they did a study where they started with 5-year-olds, and 98% of them qualified to be a creative genius. And then they followed them to adulthood, and only 2% qualified. And he did attribute it to our education system.
100%. Yeah.
And so we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the data mining, the social emotional learning, the tech ed that they're using to create this cybernetic feedback loop that not only data mines the children, but of course programs them as well. And the child abuse with, all of the, pernicious kind of concepts like the, the trans movement and the queering of the children. So we're going to get into that and hopefully come up with ways to build cognitive liberty. And then the second day is on cognitive liberty defense against political and psychological dialectical warfare. And that's a lot of like what we're talking about here, because I think people really don't understand the nature of the dialectic. And it seems abstract and philosophical and irrelevant maybe to some people. But when you understand that this is how they manipulate people and how they program them and hypnotize them. And when you're talking about taking things that people care about, it's what I call the compassion trap.
Yeah.
And this is something I'm really going to flush out, get some time, but really, and I think it's because a lot of people talk about weaponized empathy, and that's a thing that's very real, but this takes it a step further because compassion it encompasses empathy, but now it compels people to take action to alleviate another person's suffering. And I think most people want to be perceived as being good people. And we want to do that. And it's, there is an element of truth to the brotherhood of man, right? It's very hard to look somebody in the eye. This is part of why having things in person is so important. It's really hard to look somebody in the eye. And unless you're just a complete sociopath and not have some concern and compassion and, relatability to them just as a human.
Right.
And they take the best aspects of humanity and they exploit them. And this is how they divide us and pit us against each other. So I think it's so important that we understand what the dialectic is, what their tactics are, and recognize that they use it for psychological warfare. And of course, that translates to political warfare.
Right.
And I think sometimes just recognizing an op can diffuse it.
Yeah,
so,
most definitely.
Right. If you just recognize that it's even out there, then that puts some water on it and hopefully diffuses it. So,
yeah. And as we said before, that as always will be repurposed, redirected, right? But that's just why it's so important to be vigilant and continue to maintain the same perspective, which doesn't mean denying or accepting anything, but always questioning, always engaging, because it's everywhere. I mean, and this is not, I should also add too, it's not something that we should be depressed about. This is just the way of the world. There's always the yin and yang battle, good and evil. It's always happening in our lives. And it's just important if you want to be somebody who you see as, as she said, we all want to be that good person, then just simply continue.
And I think even people who are maybe not, they want to be perceived that way.
Yeah, exactly. Sociopaths included. But,
right.
But just, using this discernment will allow you to not, at least hopefully not allow your empathy to be used by powerful people that have none, And so that's why it's so important to educate yourself. Check out Courtenay's work on this. I mean, obviously she's very knowledgeable, and I think it's very important that we continue to do this, especially leading up to the election selection season. It's going to be when this goes into overdrive, as always. Most important election of our lifetime every 2 years,
Every 2 or 4, depending on what it is. And
I've heard it every 2 years, mid or primary,
exactly.
for the longest time now. You see Kamala Harris already came out and did that. Even the same thing. I know we say this every time, but this is the most important. I already said it. I wait to see it. I'm like, there it is.
I just did there's like this video of like 4 minutes long of her doing, we can what can be unburdened by what has been. And so I tried to unpack this for people. This is the Hermetic principle of correspondence, as above, so below.
Right.
And this is the mentalism, right? So this, again, where people think like, oh, this is just fringe, cuckoo people. Again, that's not me being judgmental. I'm just saying, like, people will say, Courtenay, why are you talking about these weird, religious or philosophical concepts? And so because these people are in the forefront trying to drive our policies and, impact every aspect of our life. And they really believe it. They believe, she really believes what can be. It can be unburdened by what, and this is like the Baphomet position. I can show you the,
Oh, I mean, it's the same with the prophetic discussions anywhere in the world right now. That it's clearly it's not about whether you. I mean, it matters whether we believe it's true, but the point to make is that they do, right? Or even getting into like the other conversations about what's the terms I'm looking for, in regard to the U.S. government, let's say, and media and so on, like wondering whether they have some occult practice behind what's driving them. It doesn't have to be that you believe that to be able to discuss it, but realize that they, to some degree, do think that that's how this works. So it should matter to understand it, right? I mean, and she's right. There's plenty of examples around the world where people believe in, and maybe they're right for all I know, but they definitely believe that by doing this, they'll achieve some end. And so it's important to know this stuff. So thank you for talking about us today. I really enjoyed the conversation.
I did too. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for being here for the 24th episode of the Pirate Stream, Dialectical Dissidents. We'll have plenty more coming your way. Anything else you want to leave us with on the way out?
But
anything else you want to drop to leave us with on the way out?
You can find my work if you're interested in some of this stuff. I've done some pretty deep dives on it at CourtenayTurner.com. I spell my name a little differently, so it's like Courtenay. It is Courtenay, but it's spelled Courtenay, COURTENAYTURNER.com.
Outstanding. And everything we talk about, as always, will be included down below in the show notes. Thank you for being here. And as always, remember, be a dissident.
Yes.